how Rav Soloveitchik ties a certain vision of Teshuvah together with a certain understanding of modernity, right? Modernity as really the sort of enlightenment themed discussion about individual understanding and the ability to decide for yourself who you are and what kind of life you should live, and the ability to sort of take yourself by the reins, as it were, and live the life that you want to live. And that was sort of the first week. We talked about an absolute individual responsibility for tshuva and for who you are. And the second week, we came back to that from the same picture of modernity from the other side, as it were. If the first week some people expressed some ambivalence or discomfort with the sort of absolute agency, Rav Soloveitchik gave the individual an absolute responsibility for who they are and the capacity to totally decide that. In the second week, we looked at texts where he expressed more discomfort with that idea, where he says that an important part of being, human beings is recognizing our limits and recognizing that there's always going to be a gap between who we think we should be and who we actually are in, lived life as we actually, go through our lives. And that maybe we have to minimize that gap, but actually also that critical awareness of our own limitations is itself for us a form of tshuva, that to think we could just make ourselves into who we think we should be, as he describes in the text we looked at the first week, is a sort of, religious arrogance and haughtiness. And to do tshuva for that arrogance would be to recognize our own limits. Those were the first 2 weeks, and him grappling with this one vision of modernity centered really around the Enlightenment and associated ideas. This week, I want to look at a different part of modernity. In many ways, sometimes thought of as like a reaction to Enlightenment. That would be it's true to some degree, but reductive. But it's going to be the question of nations and nationalism. Nationalism, we often think of in terms of a certain sort of individual attribute, right? And someone who is a nationalist has nationalism amongst their beliefs. It means that they are strongly connected to their nation and something like that. And that's definitely part of it, but it's also a much broader worldview, a way of thinking about how the world works and how the individual works. That nationalism means that, to some degree at least, let's say, you think the world is made up of nations, that nations are real things, that it is worth, discussing how nations work and that nations have significant impact in the world. This can be thought of in a variety of ways. So just to give a quick alternative, the United States is officially a nation state, but it's a civic nation. Anyone who's a citizen gets to be a nation, gets to be a member of the nation. A lot of other nations, this is going to be the direction we head in with Rav Soloveitchik tonight. The idea is that the nation is a real thing that exists before the state, that exists throughout history, right? Some scholars have the Jewish people, as recorded in Tanakh, as one of the first sort of national entities because they're in existence. They exist, independent of a state throughout their history in Tanakh, and then persisting afterwards. And in modernity, you have the rise of this sort of worldview, the idea that we should think about ourselves as members of nations, and those nations can be spread out across a large geographic area, right? The Germans are people who live throughout all the areas that are now considered Germany, but were once, Austria and Prussia and, all kinds of different places. They still have Bavaria, still have those names, but they, at a certain point in time, became just thought of also as Germany. And that all the people who might once have been thought of as being from different areas somehow share this underlying similarity that their Germanness. The same thing is true in America, right? What makes people from all the different states Americans, right? They all somehow participate in what it means to be an American. And the same thing is true of Jews, right? There are Jews from all over the world, all different kinds of Jews. And what makes us the same in some important sense? And some might say we're going to go with this in this direction. Is our belonging to the Jewish nation is the thing that makes us connected to each other. And nations, in this sense, one of their key roles, sort of an idea, is to take all these different, individual beings and say, despite all their differences, you're actually sort of connected in the same, because you fundamentally are not an individual. The individual part of you doesn't go all the way down, as it were. I like the image of a hand because it sort of is very concrete metaphor that all the individual fingers are rooted in the same hand at the bottom, right? So you might look like separate fingers, but they're actually one thing. And the same thing's true of the nation. So for Rav Soloveitchik, the idea is that we're going to see tonight is somehow that's an important, not merely like political idea, but also a religious idea. It's going to come up in his discussions of Teshuvah. The one thing I want to mention the last sort of important element of this is that one of the ideas also associated with nationalism is not just like, oh, this is how the world works and how individuals work, that we are fundamentally rooted in these nations, but also that nations have essences, or what in Rav Soloveitchik's language he'll use so most famously in his book called the deadening, the idea of destiny, that there's a national destiny. Each nation has, what happens to them in their real life, their fate, and their destiny, which is their sort of spiritual essence, that it is their destiny in history to, express and manifest in the world, something that they've come to into the world to realize. And so for, some nations, it's their like national literature, where they have some sort of vision of national purpose in the world. And so the key themes we've laid out right now, we're going to see in Rav Soloveitchik and his discussions of Teshuvah and the nation are about what is the sort of national essence? How do I, as an individual, connect to the Jewish people and to that national essence, and what's the relationship between those? And then also, we will touch briefly at the end at the question of the relationship between Teshuvah and the nation's state, and the question of should and to what degree nations get manifest in states, which again, Rav Soloveitchik does frame in context of Teshuvah. So that was a lot of political theory, not necessarily related to Rav Soloveitchik. If there's any questions, I'd be very happy to take them now. Otherwise, anything that feels a little abstract, I hope it will become clear as we discuss it more concretely in Rav Soloveitchik. Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen and we will hop right into text. Okay, so we are starting with, as I said before, a single essay from Al HaTeshuvah. This one's called The Individual and the Community. And, that's his themes, individual and the community. As I mentioned previously, that these essays all pretty much take their basis from sort of question or problem. And we're going to see what that is here in this first text, which is going to do with the different traditional concepts of atonement and sacrifices and things like that, were are a very important part of the tefillot of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and also of the traditional sacrificial regimes in the Beit HaMikdash around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and the way they relate to the individual. So he's going to talk about the idea of a communal sacrifice as something separate from a jointly owned sacrifice. It's completely contrary to the jointly owned sacrifice, which may have many owners, 2 or 2,000 or 2 million, according to how many people are participating in it. A communal sacrifice has one sole owner, exactly as does an individual offering. Who is its owner? It is the entire community of Israel, which, according to the law, is not the sum total or arithmetic of aggregate of such and so many individuals, but a single composite personality in its own right. Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel, and I employ the phrase in its practical connotation and not as is used in Kabbalah or mystical thought, constitutes an indivisible and separate legal body in the same way as any individual is a single legal personality. Neither Reuven nor Shimon nor Levi, not all of them together, nor all of those who contributed a half shekel toward the purchase of the offering, are regarded as the owners of the communal sacrifice. It is Knesset Yisrael as an independent body in its own right, and not as the cumulative total of such and so many individuals. Right, so he's here gotten at exactly what I was, crudely sort of gesturing at with the hand-fingers model before, that the idea of the Jewish people, Knesset Yisrael in traditional language, he's saying is that there is a fundamental single wholeness, an organic sort of wholeness to the personality. And he here says, he's not talking in terms of Kabbalah and mystical thought. When we get to the next section of the class, we'll see he also does embrace a very Kabbalistic and mystical understanding of this idea of the Jewish people as a single entity. But purposes here is saying that we can all come together to do something as a nation, and that isn't something that any one of us does individually, or even all of us together as individuals. It somehow gets deeper than our individuality in order for us to do this as a group. And the specific thing here that we do is that in the Beit HaMikdash on a regular basis, they would bring communal sacrifices, or sacrifices that were paid for by tax on the community, but weren't brought on behalf of any single individual or groups of individuals. Brought on behalf of the entirety of the Jewish people, right? And he's a little farther, and he says the same principle applies in communal sacrifice. The community as a whole owns the offering, and the individual is represented by it, insofar as he identifies himself wholly, without any reservations, to the main body of Israel. And that's going to be the thing we look for in the next couple texts, is what does it mean to identify yourself with the Jewish people? We'll get to that primarily in the last text in this section, to see yourself as part of the Jewish people. And that's important for Rav Soloveitchik, because, as I believe I left this source in, we'll see, what's called, to participate in communal sacrifices, like it says here, you have to, see yourself as part of the Jewish people. And we're seeing the next section that also affects the way you should relate to Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, he says. There's going to be a difference, he says, between how individuals can attain atonement and acquittal, and also how they confess their sins and things like that. The idea that we think about it in Tefillah on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we say the vidui, the confession, numerous times, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as a group. He says those things are different. He says the difference between individual and communal confession is tremendous. When the individual confesses, he does so from a state of insecurity, depression, and despair in the wake of sin. For what assurance has he that he will be acquitted of his sins? And who can promise him that his transgression will be forgotten and will not haunt him till the end of his days? In contrast, Knesset Yisrael, and each and every Jewish community is considered to be a microcosm of the whole of Knesset Yisrael, confesses out of a sense of confidence and even rejoicing, for it does so in the presence of a loyal ally before its most beloved one. In fact, in certain Jewish communities, I myself heard this in Germany, it is customary for the whole congregation to sing Al Chet, confession, in heartwarming melodies. For the achievement of individual acquittal, he has to repent, do spiritual stock taking, confess, acknowledge his sins, experience regret, and purify himself. In order to partake of the communal acquittal, he must be bound to the community. The stronger his bond, the greater the degree of acquittal he will enjoy through the intermediation of the community. Right, so he has two different sort of points here. In the first paragraph, he says the Jewish people as a whole have a special relationship with God that transcends and can't be reduced to the individual Jew's relationship with God. Right? Not a question of like other non-Jews, we're just talking about the difference between the Jewish people as a whole, the sort of national covenant with God, and the individual's relationship with God. And he says the individual must come fraught with all the negative emotions we talked about last time to the question of judgment, to the question of atonement, and can I attain judgment and atonement? And the community, he says, the community is guaranteed acquittal. God does not leave the Jews unforgiven. And in contrast, the individual, he says, has to do spiritual stock taking, confess, acknowledge sins, experience regret, and purify himself. Right? It is a rigorous individual endeavor. It requires lots of different steps, lots of introspection and internal work. And for the communal level, the thing you as an individual have to do is identify with the nation and feel bound to the nation. And notably, I'll say here also, he is talking to some degree about the community, right? You should feel part of your community as a microcosm of the entirety of the nation on sort of the local level. But his main emphasis is on the national level. And it's worth taking an aside just to think about what Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur look like nowadays, in contrast to say what they looked like in the time of sacrifices, right? When there was a Beit HaMikdash where sacrifices were brought, where there was a intricate and lengthy sacrificial rites that were done in the Beit HaMikdash on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for the purpose of attaining atonement, particularly Yom Kippur. And if you think about it, we now on Yom Kippur, in sort of the traditional Siddur, say some version of the entirety of the Avodah, the sacrificial rites of Yom Kippur. And it's a lengthy section of Musaf. It's right there in the heart of how many pages do we have left territory. And the individuals tend to say it mostly by themselves. In some sections we'll sing together, but you get this moment in davening where a lot of people are standing there looking at the siddur, reading through it as individuals. But the thing they're reading is not something that they would ever have seen in real life for the most part. Right? Most Jews would not have been at the Beit HaMikdash for Yom Kippur. Most Jews would have been wherever else doing their own thing. Like the Avodah rites were not something that people necessarily witnessed. There's some discussion of like the people of Yerushalayim maybe witnessing it, but not everyone. The sacrificial acts that bring atonement on the community are not something that they would have had even like visual participation. It was nothing you have to see. It's something that you would know, maybe think about was happening somewhere well far away from you. And the way you participate in it is just by knowing that you're a part of it and right, feeling a part of the national religion. Right, the communal sacrifices that he was discussing in the text at source number 1 are again something that most Jews would not ever have experienced, being brought on their behalf. It's something that as a member of the nation, they participate in. And so that's what he's talking here is a form of teshuvah, a form of atonement that is attained not through the work of teshuvah, right? Not through either of the forms we discussed last week of changing yourself or recognizing your own limits, but through participating in the Jewish people. And he in this last piece, this is like the very last paragraph of this drasha, he digs down on what sort of exactly he means here. He's going to give us 2 different ways in which you do this. A Jew who has lost his faith in Knesset Israel, even though he may personally sanctify and purify himself by being strict in his observance of the precepts and by setting prohibitions upon himself, such a Jew is incorrigible and totally unfit to join the Day of Atonement, which encompasses the whole of Knesset Israel in all its components and all its generations. Right? He says that there's a negative aspect to this too. Not only is there a sort of special belonging to and participating in Yom Kippur that happens through belonging to the Jewish collective, but also the flip side, if you reject the Jewish collective, then you have sort of excluded yourself from Yom Kippur in some sense. And he elsewhere in this piece cites variety of texts, kol haporesh midarkei tzibur, anyone who separates themselves from the ways of the community. There's all kinds of different consequences to that. Only the Jew who believes in Knesset Israel may partake of the sanctity of the day and the acquittal granted to him as a part of the community of Israel. The Jew who believes in Knesset Israel is the Jew who lives as part of it wherever it is and is willing to give his life for it, feel its pain, rejoices with it, fights in its wars, groans at its defeats, and celebrates its victories. Right? That to be a member of the Jewish people is to be both emotionally engaged and committed to the Jewish people, right? That you groan at its defeats and celebrate its victories, to feel the suffering of Jews wherever they are suffering, even if you are not actively suffering yourself, and also participatory, right? He's willing to give his life for it, fights in its wars. That these are strictly martial imagery, but he'll elsewhere talk of it in terms of tzedakah and like sending money to Jews around the world. It's easy to think also about things like the Jews across the world who were involved in the attempt to get Soviet Jews out of Russia and help them in a variety of ways. And the way that involved both symbolic acts, such as putting a chair at the Seder table to really feel that pain, but also in all kinds of different, more practical endeavors. And that's what it means to be a part of these people, is to feel that it is something to which you are committed and to which you would sacrifice on whatever level, whether it's willing to give his life for it, but even on the more minor sacrifices of like putting money towards that end. The Jew who believes in Knesset Israel is a Jew who binds himself with unseverable bonds, not only to the people of Israel of his own generation, but to the community of Israel throughout the ages. How so? Through the Torah, which embodies the spirit and the destiny of Israel from generation to generation unto eternity. Right, that the way you commit to Jews, past and future, is by learning Torah for Rav Soloveitchik. Learning Torah becomes an act of communion with the voices of Jews from the past. The voices were, for some selection of them, recorded in Torah. but all of whom themselves would have sort of embraced Torah, and a commitment to pass the Torah onwards to the future, something that goes in both directions. And that Torah, as you said here, the spirit and destiny of Israel. It is, we're going to see the very core of the Jewish people for Rav Soloveitchik is the Torah in a broad and expansive sense, such that to identify with the Jewish people, part of what that means is not just the section I bolded before about participating in its pains and sufferings, which you could also argue is true of any nationalism, right? It's true of being part of any nation is going to look kind of like that. What makes Jewish nationalism unique for Rav Soloveitchik, or Torah nationalism, is that aspect of it, the Torah, that it is embodied not in reading the fairy tales of Brothers Grimm, or reading Shakespeare, or Ralph Waldo Emerson, or any sort of national literature. It's embodied in the Torah. So then I want to look at one piece from an entirely different text. It's also from a text about Teshuvah that doesn't come up here quite as much. And this is, I think, the most intense version I found in his writings of this idea, that there's in fact some sort of religious service, some sort of important religious obligation to belong to the Jewish people in a active and conscious and intentional sense. It comes here from a book published in Hebrew called Divrei Hashkafa. And he says, the primary element of worship of the heart is ethical admixture within Knesset Yisrael, right? Worship of the heart, avodah shebelev, traditionally understood to mean davening, right? Tefillah, prayer. And it is the primary aspect of worship of the heart, of the inner work of being a religious Jew, is to make yourself feel bound up ethically with Knesset Yisrael, with the Jewish people. This is the source of purification. The individual sins when he sinks his entirety into his individual identity and his unique existence, separating from the community, right? Poresh min hatzibur is itself a sin in this language. The sin of the individual is in his aloneness, his self-creation as if as an isolated individual, right? And self-creation is exactly the theme we talked about 2 weeks ago. That if you see yourself as this totally isolated individual for Rav Soloveitchik, that is in fact some kind of sin. Absolute individuality like this distorts a person's path in life. Collectivity is what purifies and draws the sinner closer to the Creator. A person's life must flow not into his inner life, but outwards, toward the other. Existence is all-encompassing, and unification with the all, such with everything, with everything. God dwells within the collective, in the Knesset, within historical belonging. The return to God is itself also a return to the community, to the collective. Those who stray from the nation are not attached to God. The secret of this detachment is hidden within fateful historical moments, in the collective responsibility of Knesset Yisrael. All of Israel are responsible for each other. Why? Because there is no existence within the interdependent, constricted borders of many Jews. All of Israel is rooted in a shared historical reality. The approach of the Jew to God is communal, together. Right, so like I said, that's the most intense version of this. There's another essay in Al HaTeshuvah and on repentance where he has rehearses a similar line. A Jew approaches God only through the God of Israel, through the collective. And this is, I think, an underrated aspect of Rav Soloveitchik, right? The texts we looked at the first week, particularly the ones from Halachic Man, are a lot more well known. But something I think that is underrated and important in his thought is the question to which who you are is constructed by the people you see yourself as a part of, the people who've shaped your life. And he's very aware that ultimately there is some degree of communal influence on you that can't you can't ever get away from. And that has ethical implications, right? That was the phrase he used in the last text we look at, the ethical admixture within Knesset Yisrael. That's not just about seeing yourself as part of something bigger than yourself. It's about living that out in practice and being willing to put yourself on the line in whatever way, whether it's just as tzedakah, whether it's as so like I could just start listing things and everything feels like someone will disagree with it, but like making aliyah on the one hand, going to protest for or against things on the other hand. There are lots of different ways of understanding what it means to be belonging to the Jewish people. But if you're not willing to do that in sort of any form, then the Rav Soloveitchik would say that's not just a nationalistic flaw, right? It's not that you're being a bad member of the nation. He thinks there's a real religious aspect to that. that God chooses the Jews, as not isolated individuals, but as members of the Jewish people. And therefore, to participate in a relationship with God necessarily also means, in whatever sense, to put yourself in active relationship with the rest of the Jewish people. So any thoughts and questions on that before we move on to the next stage? Okay. So that was, we call it returning to the nation, that your individual tshuva, part of that, Rav Soloveitchik, has to be learning to identify with the Jewish people and working on actively, intentionally identifying with the Jewish people outside yourself. The next text we're going to look at is going to be about the tshuva of the nation in some ways doing tshuva. This is an essay called Jewish Sovereignty and the Redemption of the Shekhinah. It was first published in 2021 in Tradition. It's now been published, I think, last year, 2023, maybe 2022, in a new book of Zionist drashot called The Return to Zion. And this is a drasha he gave in Yiddish. A lot of them were given in Yiddish to the Mizrahi Conference in 1948 in the spring. So this is after the state of Israel is declared, and we'll see that at some point that actually comes up. So within months after the establishment of the state of Israel, he gives this drasha called Jewish Sovereignty and the Redemption of the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah is a word we'll explore as we go through, but is the traditional term often translated as divine presence. It refers to God being somehow in history or present with the Jewish people. In Kabbalah, in the sort of chain of Kabbalistic terms and symbols that get attached together, it also gets attached to the phrase we've used now several times, Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel. So the Shekhinah, which is the divine presence, is also the community of Israel, and in that sense, the way God is sort of embodied in the world through the Jewish people. And that's going to be important because the basic theme of this essay is the question of exile and redemption and tshuva. And is there a form of exile that's not just political and geographic exile, that is in fact an exile of sin in some sort? And is there redemption that's not just political and geographical redemption, coming back to a specific land and establishing sovereignty? Is it also a spiritual redemption? And are those ideas related or separable or not? And that's, he's going to argue ultimately that yes, exile can be, there's a spiritual exile and there's a spiritual redemption, and that you cannot separate those from the physical and political versions of those ideas, because traditionally physical geographic exile happens because of what he calls spiritual exile, because of sin. But also when we're returning to the land, the question is going to ask, can we return to Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel without also returning to Jewish destiny, to the Torah? And if we were to try that, would that be a catastrophe? And that's where he's going to go at the end. He moves in some ways from celebrating the national return to the land that we're going to talk about here to also being ambivalent about the ways it could be misused. He says, the sages of Israel, source number 5, developed the metaphysical, mystical idea of the Shekhinah in exile. The Rabbanu Shalom, Master of the Universe, suffers in exile together with Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of Israel. And just as Jews need redemption and salvation, so does the Shekhinah. This is, in a sense, one of the sort of potentially very radical ideas, theologically radical ideas of Chazal, that the sages of Israel, that God himself God's self might need redemption in whatever way. And that provides the basis for this idea that the God's presence in the world in the form of the Jewish people or the Knesset Yisrael needs redemption alongside the political existence of the Jewish people. The idea of the Shekhinah in exile is associated with the Torah's very interesting relationship to the sinner. And so this is going to be an important paragraph here, which sets up the idea of spiritual exile. The Torah opened the gates of repentance to the sinner caught completely in the net of sin, whether because of wealth, honor, or emancipation. Even if one was wicked all his days and repented at the end, none of his wickedness is remembered. As it says, as long as the sun does not darken and the light and the moon and the stars and the thick clouds return to the rain. A person can always do teshuvah, even when he is mired in the 49th level of impurity. Completely independent of his crimes, the central kernel of the subjective I consciousness remains pure and holy. Only external man sins, the superficial I, who does not represent the inner essence of spiritual existence. The soul always remains pure. And what you get here is a layered structure to what it means to be a person, right? Internal and external. Oh, and you says you sin just with the external. And that's important because that's his model also for the Jewish people. He says the Jewish people have an inner core. And that's the Torah, right? The destiny of the Jews. And the Shekhinah is in exile when the Jews abandon their inner core and live a life that is inauthentic, is unrelated to who they truly are inside as the people of the Torah. Right? And so what that means, however, is that you can't ever abandon the Torah completely. You cannot be lost to Torah for Rav Soloveitchik because it remains the inner core of the Jewish people, and the Jews always have the potential to return to it. And in fact, in a few places, including in that individual and collective essay in On Repentance, he says there's some guarantee by God that the Jews will always return to their essence, that eventually, in the end of days, all of the Jews will do teshuvah, will return to the Torah because it is their essence. But so here he's going to say, sort of flesh this out in relationship to Knesset Yisrael. He says, sin is imposed on Knesset Yisrael. Sin never comes from the inner depths of its existence. The exile of the Shekhinah can be conceptualized in a twofold sense. First, we understand it simply in the sense of defilement of the Shekhinah due to modern exile in daily contact between Knesset Yisrael and the nations of the world. When socio-economic life is integrated with general political structures, the fundamentals of religion are broken and the most beautiful values are desecrated. And around this time, he writes another essays talking about just the internalization by Jews of socioeconomic ways of thinking that he associates with modernity. If anyone was here for my classes back in February talking about artificial intelligence, we looked at some of these texts. This is the characteristic ideas of modernity being about the rise of utilitarian thinking, and that those get internalized by Jews as Jews become more modern in the modern era. And he says, but we must also understand the exile of the Shekhinah in a much deeper sense, in the sense of her diminution, tzimtzum, another Kabbalistic idea. For our purposes here, it just means diminution, some sort of shrinking down from full stature. In exile, even in the most religious and ideal circumstances, even when the Shekhinah does not become impure, she contracts and is reduced. Right? So even if, he says, Jews don't internalize utilitarian ways of thinking, the spiritual aspect of Jews becomes reduced. This contraction is due to the fact that man lives not only within his own private domain, but is also part of a society and a community. The more life becomes modernized, the more constrained the domain of his intimate private life, while conversely, public social life expands. Right? The idea is that in modernity in the West, the public sphere becomes the sphere of individuals. Right? If anyone's wondering where the term liberal in liberal Judaism comes from, it's associated with the liberal movements more broadly that arise in Germany and the rise of the liberal state, which is a state of individuals. And you can have religious communities and religious life within the state, but the state is fundamentally a state of individuals. And there's a line popularly attributed to Moses Mendelssohn that is actually from someone else who I've forgotten. To this point, the idea of you should be a Jew in your home and a German outside your home, which the line is attempting to capture something like this, that for Soloveitchik, the problem is that in modernity, when we join liberal states, that for all the good that brings, it brings a privatization of Judaism, right? The man lives not only under private domain, also society and community. And those things stop being as sort of deeply interwoven. He says, pieties in countries where one is a minority means being pious only in his private personal life, Shabbat, family purity, kashrut, etc., surrounded by the curtains of one's home sanctuary. It is completely impossible to represent such a life as an embodiment of a full and complete Torah. My socio-economic existence is linked to the general political economic structure, which is based on other principles. As such, it does not embody my social, political, or legal relationships with society. Whether I sin or not is an entirely different question. The entire complex of my internal interactions with society is divorced from Judaism. Today, however, I skipped a few lines. He said many of Choshen Mishpat and Even HaEzer issues are halachot only applicable to Messianic times. Judaism has been reduced to a few chapters in Yoreh De'ah and Orach Chaim. These are the 4 books of the Shulchan Aruch, often referred to as the Code of Jewish Law, and they're the ones that govern civil law and societal issues have basically been rendered as messianic texts that do not apply in the present, and only the strictly we might call religious laws, as if Shabbat, family purity, and kashrut, things that are functions of the individual's life, first and foremost, those ones are still called Judaism, right? He says elsewhere in a book called Halachic Mind, he's like, yeah, Judaism includes all of the things we think of as morality and like interpersonal issues. But the nature of Jewish life in the present is that we tend to think of Jewish things and religious things as praying, as learning Torah, as specifically Jewish rituals that look foreign to non-Jews. But theoretically, the Torah includes business laws and laws governing social interactions and things like that. And the tzimtzum of the Shekhinah, the diminution and reduction of the stature of the divine presence in the Jewish people, is first and foremost a function of the Jewish life being reduced to individual existence rather than having some sort of thick social existence governed by Jewish law. So this is something that's going to come with the question of not just spiritual exile, spiritual redemption has to come to try and fix this problem. With regard to the redemption of the Shekhinah, source number 8, from Tzimtzum, I understand this idea simply to mean the revival of many parts of the Torah, the rewriting of abstract letters upon the concrete parchment of historical reality, right? Sort of the restoring of the Torah. I specifically mean the public Torah laws. Indeed, there is Shabbat, the law of forbidden foods, other commandments applying to individuals. But even in regard to public Sabbath observance, there is no tzibur, no collective aspect. When an individual is multiplied by hundreds of thousands, their acts are not public per se. Their individual character remains, however, the social, political, economic life of Israel. Their individual character remains. However, the social, political, and economic life of Israel needs to be expressed via the seal of Judaism, of Jewish law and morality. The various phases of state life must be permeated with the Jewish spirit, understood and interpreted by Torah and spiritual giants. Right. So he's here speaking again as there is a new state rising. The state of Israel has been declared, and they're still really figuring out what its internal dynamics are going to look like. What is going to be the space of religion in Israel? And I should say at this point already that in the late 60s or mid 60s, he's asked to become to put his hat in the ring for chief rabbi of the state of Israel. He doesn't, he's not asked to directly become, it's not an appointed position, it's elected, but he's asked to allow himself to be named as a candidate for the chief rabbinate. And he says no for a bunch of reasons. But one of the recurring reasons he says to a variety of people is that he doesn't really believe in, compulsory Judaism, and that Judaism as a aspect of a political apparatus will necessarily be compulsory, that to some degree the function of states is to make and enforce laws, and making and enforcing laws based on halakha just means people aren't freely keeping halakha. And he is a teacher who teaches people things and teaches them to persuades people, perhaps convinces people of the rightness of Judaism, but is not interested in trying to enforce it. So I should say that from the outset, but he is very much talking about some vision of a Jewish state that would not have a strict separation between religion and state. Because here he's not envisioning it just in terms of like religion. He's envisioning in terms of national identity, national spirit, that the Jewish nation, in its say like national texts of the Torah, have this set of moral laws, and those are to be fully realizing ourselves, not as individuals, but as a collective. It would mean to live a life where we make rules for ourselves as a collective, right? If in the first class we talked about moral and intellectual autonomy, that you are in charge of yourself when you make the rules of your own life, this is the same sort of autonomy, but on a national level. And I should note that we often today think of nationalism in contrast to individualism, and that let's say, revolutionary rhetoric in the West has been taken up today by individualists who believe that the world shouldn't even really need states, just be individuals. When nations rose as an idea, that was the liberatory, revolutionary idea of the day, that nations and the possibility of national self-determination was a revolutionary cause against empire, that the old multinational, globe-spanning empires and religious empires were crumbling, and they were being replaced by nations which would govern themselves. Right. So he says for Jewish self-governance should look specifically Jewish, as the nation tries to govern itself based on its national cultural heritage and history, which again he identifies with the Torah. Now here he's going to speak in sort of to his immediate present tense. A Jewish state was created, right? This is right after the state of Israel is created. A state does not exhaust itself in Jewish ministries, a Jewish post office, a Jewish army, or a Jewish representative in the United Nations, right? All of the political and military apparatuses of a country is not enough to make it Jewish. The fact that those are, positions are held by Jews. They are necessary instruments of a state, but they do not represent its essence. The state of Israel is expressed primarily in the form of a political nation. The nation is politically merged into an organic unity that expresses itself in a formal legal sense civically, but in socio-philosophical terms in regard to the ideology of a nation in a political sense, right? When the nation, the state puts together its people who make up the voting body of the state, as it were, the authorizing citizens of the authoritative citizens of the state, they come together as a nation. And so that nation has to be somehow specifically Jewish. In a Jewish state, a political nation must emerge. We already say that we, the Jews of exile, do not dare to mix ourselves into the affairs of the land of Israel. This is simply because, in a formal legal sense, we are citizens of another country, right? So that what's called the people who live in the land of Israel and constitute its citizenry are sort of by definition a different group from the Jews of the outside the land of Israel. In addition, on a social philosophical level, this end of this we'll come back to in a second. I want to stop for a second and talk about what we just talked about. All right, so this is, in some sense, the second half of the idea of Teshuvah we're getting at today, right? The first thing we talked about was Teshuvah as an individual, as a member of the nation, and to the part of there's a form of Teshuvah that is seeing yourself as part of the Jewish people, right? Celebrating the Jews' victories, mourning their defeats, their losses, feeling connected to Jews around the world, right? If a Jew gets hurt somewhere on the other side of the world, you should suffer for that. You should feel solidarity with them. Here, the question is, the thinking about the Jews as a collective, how should we live our lives, right? Believing in Jewish self-determination, Jewish collective existence, those sorts of things. And for that, it comes down to the question of the Torah, which he sees as, in some ways, how the individual Jew and the Jewish collective are connected, right? That the individual Jew is connected to the Jewish collective through the mechanism of the Torah that represents the Jewish people's essence. And because that represents the Jewish people's essence, its destiny, in his language, that is both how you as an individual collect by learning Torah and seeing yourself as part of the Jewish past and Jewish future, but also what it would mean to create a Jewish form of self-determination, right? That is a collective Jewish existence that is something uniquely Jewish, right? That follows our own self-understanding and our own traditional laws and literature, would be based on the Torah rather than based on any other external ideas, you might say. And the vision he has for what that looks like, that what qualifies as Teshuvah, which is also spiritual redemption, is to create a Jewish state based on Jewish laws. So any questions on this so far? Great. So this is, those are the two models of Teshuvah and as nationalism, the individual's Teshuvah to embrace nationalism, and the nation's Teshuvah as a whole. With that, I want to look at the relationship of this model to states And the idea of the nation state, again, is a very modern idea of where political power comes from, that it comes from this idea of national self-determination and the way that could go too far, as it were, whereas he becomes concerned about it. Yeah, so the nation and the state against political idolatry. And this is back in the same essay we've been looking at, Jewish sovereignty, redemption of the Shekhinah. He says the assumption that political social exile is also exile of the Shekhinah is a concept that's well accepted. However, the conclusion that political redemption of Israel also means the redemption of the Shekhinah is an idea that many do not understand. And he's gonna dive here into a midrash, which we'll explain quickly, and then we'll look at his application. He quotes the beginning of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim is said loud and clear for all to hear, but the rating hutzeiti itcha, I was taken out with you, has often been silenced. There's a midrash he quotes just before this that says when God says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, it should be read, at least in addition, as Asher hutzeiti itcha, that I was taking out with you from the land of Egypt. That in some sense, God in Egypt was in exile and was in need of redemption. And so God is both the active agent of redemption from Egypt, right? Hotzeiticha, but also a passive object of redemption. I was taken out. And he's going to say it is the spiritual aspect of this, the way religion itself is redeemed through political redemption, that has often been silenced. It is the entire emancipation movement in Western Europe in the last century, the so-called rationalist liberation campaign, as well as the social revolutionary movements of Jewish youth in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia in the beginning of the century, as well as the assimilatory ideologies today, all wanted and still want to separate Hotzeiticha from Hutzeiti Itcha, right? The question of can you have the solution to the Jewish problem without the solution to the problem of Judaism, in the language of Echad Ha'am, right? Many people, both Jews and non-Jews, were looking for solutions to the Jewish problem, which is where the term final solution ends up coming from. But the Echad Ha'am, someone who noticed that you have to talk about not just Jews, but about Judaism. And Rav Soloveitchik is doing something similar, right? But whereas Echad Ha'am talked about Jewish culture, Rav Soloveitchik is talking specifically about Torah and Judaism and halakha. But the idea that you can't just have Jews and saving Jews, you have to also save Judaism. They wish to attain redemption and freedom precisely through forgetting the exile of the Shekhinah, forgetting the sanctity of Israel, weakening our values, desecrating our ideals, abandoning the Shabbat, eliminating Torah, and so on. In a word, it seeks to remove the specifically Jewish gestalt and thereby gain rights of equality, right? To, again, save Jews by abandoning Judaism. We can justify ourselves for committing sins whose source is exile, as I mentioned before, but for the sin of false liberation, of separating Hutzeiticha from Hutzeiti Itcha, there can no longer be any mitigating circumstances. Such a sin is one of idolatry, and for this we must say al chet. I think in his tone here, you can hear the fact that he came from a background that was fundamentally anti-Zionist. In his youth, he was a member of Agudat Yisrael, the sort of Haredi political organization wouldn't be quite the right term, but something like that. They're thinking in terms of Jewish collective from a Haredi perspective, and he moves to join Mizrahi, the religious Zionist movement. And this is a speech he gave to a Mizrahi event. And he has, at this point, they put out 2 books of his Zionist drashot, 3 if you include Kol Dodi Dofek, and they're talking to Mizrahi and they're very Zionist stuff. But you can hear here and other places his discomfort with, if not Zionism in the abstract, then the way secular Zionism often lived out its life in practice, that it often had a not simply secular, but also anti-religious tone to it. And in very anti-religious in practice, they were often cruel to the religious Jews who've been living in Israel when they first came. There's no need to paper over that. And so he says, look, if you try and have sort of totally secular Zionism, you were to have he was sort of lumping that in here with assimilation and some form of gaining equality in non-Jewish context in the emancipation movements of Western Europe. That would be a problem, right? That is a form of idolatry. I mean, to make political life independent of religious life, its own value, is idolatry. And he has a short essay published in Hebrew called Hachet Kaved Shel Dorenu, right? The great sin of our generation, or the weighty sin of our generation. That's all about that topic, the way that as modern individuals, we raise political life to a supreme principle and disconnect it from other values and from religion specifically. And that is something he sees as, idolatry. Um, a statehood is important not as a goal, but as a means. And to get back to what is this Jewish state supposed to look like, the goal transcends statehood, time, and history. I don't want you to misunderstand me. I don't underestimate the value of political sovereignty. I'm just opposed to a cult of sovereignty. No idol must be made of the land of Israel itself. She must serve a higher objective. What is this objective? A Knesset Yisrael, which represents not just any political nation, but a Torah nation, a kingdom of heaven nation, which is not limited to territorial borders. Right? The idea that the state of Israel represents not just the citizenry of Israel, but also the Jewish people who live both in the state of Israel and outside of it. And we'll come back to that in a second. But the state can never be its own value, right? It doesn't define the be-all and end-all of Jewish life. It doesn't become the pure standard of what's good, right? And this is the second time he's invoked idolatry, the primordial, like greatest sin of the Jewish people. The idea, like the thing you cannot do worse than, for the most part, right? That is the risk of redemption, is the idea that the state itself might become an idol. And notably, he says not just the state becoming an idol, but no idol must be made of the land of Israel itself. He'll elsewhere say that, like, attributing special spiritual qualities to physical objects such as land is a form of idolatry. Here, he's talking about something slightly different, which is that the states are by definition territorial. States are how a certain group of people assert dominance and self-determination and power, authority over a specific territory. He says having a state where we can have the territory to realize Judaism in the public square is a fundamental good. It's a form of redemption. But if you get so obsessed with having that territory that you miss out on the realizing the Jewish life in the public square aspect of it, then that is where the land has become more important than Judaism, and that's a problem. And just to return to the not limited territorial borders part, it also does something weird he's worried about to the relationship between the Jews and the Jews in Israel and the Jews outside of Israel. He says the negation of exile, and this was a classic Zionist term, shlilat hagolah, the negation of exile, should not be the motto now, even if certain Israeli Mizrahi leaders want it to be so. Right? We should not be engaged in rejecting exile. There should be only a feeling of obligation towards the exile, an obligation in the sense that the small country of Israel, with its political legal nation, should be a force on behalf of the larger Knesset Israel that embodies the Shekhinah and bears the flag of the men of the Great Assembly with great, mighty, and awesome etched on her, right? Gadol, Gibor, V'Norah. That the Jewish people as a whole, he does not imagine them all living in the state of Israel that is now coming up around him. And he's saying this is, in fact, a form of redemption, right? This redemptive state of Israel will only have some portion of the Jewish people living in it, and that doesn't give them any more claim to being Jews than Jews outside of Israel, right? He says if you can't disconnect the Jewish people in Israel from Jewish people outside of Israel and evaluate them differently just because some of them live in the state. Like, there's something great about the state, there's no question about it, right? He calls it the redemption of the Shekhinah, of God in history. But it automatically threatens to say, who is Am Yisrael? It's people who live within a certain territory, instead of Am Yisrael being all of the Jews who live anywhere, right? And this is where, in some sense, the Teshuvah of the nation is already threatening the nationalistic Teshuvah of the individual we saw at the beginning. Because one of the things about the nationalistic Teshuvah we saw in the first section of this class is feeling committed to Jews wherever they are and in any part of the world and wherever their suffering is and trying to help them. And here he's pointing out that if you get too caught up on the way politics allows us to realize Judaism in a specific territory, you miss out on that aspect of, well, Jews live everywhere and we have to care about Jews everywhere. It doesn't have to do that. The state of Israel, like I mentioned before, the fight to get Soviet Jews out of Russia, like the main place they went was single place they went was Israel. Like, no question, Israel was incredibly instrumental for that. Similarly, Operation Moses and the Ethiopians making Aliyah, like, no question the state of Israel is a good force for that, but he's very worried about this risk. So we're going to stop here. There is another text on the last page, which is just about the way loyalty to the state could come to subvert loyalty to God, but we're not going to look at that right now. And anyone's willing to, you're welcome to look at that on your own. Any questions right now for the last 3 minutes we have left?
Thank you for including the final source. Hopefully I'll be able to look into that before the end of class.
So if there's no other questions, my email is again at the top of the source sheet for anyone who wants to follow up at any point in time. Thank you all so much for joining me on these shiurim. Thank you to Evie for wonderful moderating, and to Drisha in general for this opportunity. Everyone else, I wish you a wonderful Shana Tova, and all of us a much better year.
Thank you, Rabbi Amar, Shana Tova, and thank you and Shana Tova to everyone who participated in this class and for always being part of our learning community here at Drisha. Lehitraot.
Thank you.